Hello to our viewers around the world. Welcome to another session of Luohan On Air. I'm Chen, CGT anchor. And could somebody mute that phone? All right. So today we're talking about assessing the pandemic economy. We know that the pandemic has raged on around the world for more than 4 months now. Some economies have reopened, others are just easing back into things. How are economies tracking as unemployment grows, as companies' losses rack up? And what is the best information to give decision makers the best tools to help them assess and make, hopefully, the smartest decisions? Well, joining us for this discussion are a Nobel Laureate economist, Micheal Spence, joining us from on the coast in Italy this time, as opposed to being stuck in the city in Milan. And also Professor Chen, who is joining us from Beijing. He's the Executive Director at Luohan Academy. Welcome to our discussion, gentlemen. So, right now we're looking at the pandemic economy. And the world, you're seeing a lot of very devastating economic statistics. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on a macro trend level about this?
Well, I think that, first of all, let me say, I think that this project and set of tools is going to be enormously useful to everybody, but especially to policymakers, because they're making very difficult decisions about the balancing, dealing with the virus and the pandemic on the one hand, and opening their economies to limit the damage with respect to people's livelihoods and possibly longer term damage. So I think this is an enormously powerful sort of support tool to kind of get that done. The Academy has also done a good job of sort of looking at the whole global economy. And I think the best way to describe it, as I see it, is that what we're dealing with waves. So the first wave was sort of China and a few Asian countries. The second wave is more or less developed countries, America, Canada, all of Europe, basically. And then there's a third wave that I think we'll probably want to spend some time talking about, which is coming at it later, but it's now accounts for well over 50% of the confirmed new cases, and where there's much more problematic patterns with respect to the coevolution of the economy and the virus.
Professor Chen, the waves, your thoughts on the macro trends?
Yeah, so I think, let me give you a couple of examples to show why we need to consider the post-pandemic and economy together. Now, on the one hand, we do know that the pandemic is hitting the world hard. If you look at United States, more than 2 million people has been confirmed infected, and more than 117,000 people diseased. Look at Brazil, it's approaching 1 million confirmed infection cases very fast, and more than 40,000 people dead. Look at Russia, it has exceeded 500,000 people infected. And look at India, more than 300,000 people have been confirmed. So that's on the pandemic side. We see a lot of the life loss. It's very tragic. On the other hand, then we see a lot of countries, they are experiencing very record high economic loss. If you look at the United States, according to the predictions, in the second quarter, its annualized GDP reduction will be more than 30%, which would be the highest since the Great Depression. Look at UK. The numbers just came out that since the February to April, UK its economic loss is around more than 17%. Then that's also the highest since the Second World War. If you look at some import and export numbers, they're just very dramatic. Look at, for example, India. Its import shrunk by, in April, shrunk by 45%. Export shrunk by 52%. Germany, import shrunk by 21%. Export 31%. France, import shrunk by 25%. Export 32%. United States, import shrunk by 14%. and export 25%. Mexico shrunk by 24% and 39% respectively. So we're looking at, this is the thing. So we cannot separate pandemic from the economy because we have to win both battles simultaneously. In order to control the virus, we have to slow down the economy, the so-called distancing economy. And that is at the cost of the economy. When the economy slows down, people suffer. Unemployment goes up. Companies shut down, especially in the SMEs. So how do we balance to win both battles? What is the best way to do this? We need to have an effective way to measure and track pandemic and economy at the same time. That's why Luohan Academy, and we're working, also work with Mike, we together we're trying to develop a measure and tracking system to help the world to understand what's going on. And that's exactly what Mike mentioned. We can see clearly the countries are in waves at different stage.
So, Mike, we keep talking about how unprecedented this crisis is, and yet we seem to be relying on the traditional economic numbers to help make decisions. I mean, how timely and how relevant are those numbers? We're talking GDP, we're talking trade, PMIs, etc.
So the traditional measures that we use to track the performance of all economies aren't very helpful in this context for a very simple reason, and that is that they come out with a distinct lag. They tend to be reported, periodically, and the reason that's not very helpful in this context is that things are changing so fast, right? So GDP, right now we have GDP numbers for the first quarter because we haven't finished the second quarter. Well, so much has happened. Basically, the entire, except for China and some of the first wave, everything that's happened since then has happened within, the end of a quarter and the start of another quarter. So if you pay attention to that kind of number, you basically are so out of date that you can't make real-time decisions. I mean, the real innovation, I think, that it goes with the Academy's project here is to try to get at real time, meaning daily updates on what's going on in the economy with respect to both the virus, and related statistics, which tend to come out with a higher frequency, and the economic data. So I just think this is a kind of giant leap forward for people who are willing to take the time to use it. There are some economic numbers that come out somewhat more frequently, like unemployment data, but that tends to be more useful for economies that have mostly a formal labor sector. Many of the economies that we're trying to track, or that I'm trying to help out with this project and tracking, have huge informal sectors where the unemployment data really don't tell you anything.
Like China, India, Thailand.
Yeah, India, Brazil. I mean, and in poorer countries, the fraction's even larger. So the bottom line is, you really need a different way of trying to estimate what's really going on in the economy, as Chen Long just said. If you're going to have a kind of current picture to help you make sensible decisions about opening up.
Professor Chen, how hard was it to come up with a tool that would give you, well, not instantaneous, but fairly up-to-date, almost as up-to-date as what we can expect from the pandemic tally, and for each part of the world? How challenging is that task?
Yeah, so firstly, as we mentioned, that the biggest challenge is for each country is actually to balance the two threats on the pandemic side, on the economic recovery side. And that has been extremely difficult, because if they cannot measure it, then it's very hard for them to make decisions. If you look at let me give you some examples. It's just very hard lessons. For example, it's just back in March. Actually, at that time, China has suffered a lot on both the economy and the life side. So we actually, but unfortunately, the lesson was not quite learned by Europe at that time. So even back in March, there are still countries, for example, England is still talking about this called herd immunity concept. So at that time, and it's just very unfortunate because in the end, UK has become the country in Europe that suffers the most lives, and also the economic recovery was the slowest. But it's very hard for the countries to, and also another country is, let me give you is Sweden. So if we compare Sweden and Norway, let's say, similar countries, North Europe countries, but you can see that Sweden suffers the life loss is like 10 times higher. So how do we exactly balance the two sides? Now it's up to every country's governments and citizens to decide. But we do know that you just have to be able to measure and track them to make the decisions. Otherwise, it will be too difficult. So we've been trying to think about every day we're tracking the pandemic progress, the progress to see what's going on. But how can we track the economy side also on a daily basis? Then gradually it occurs to us that actually there's a very strong relation between every country's mobility and its economic performance. So essentially, mobility is the key concept that combines the impact of pandemic and economy together. So essentially, in order to control the pandemic, then you have to reduce the mobility, which is the distancing. If you reduce the mobility, you are reducing the economic activity. So that somehow will show up on the economy side. So we realize that actually, if you understand, you can measure how deeply reduced a country's, in terms of the mobility reduction, how deeply that country is in that stage and for how long, you can essentially figure out, roughly speaking, the impact of the pandemic on the economy. So let me give you a more direct example. We measured and we found that for the first quarter, by mid-May, at that time, about 20 countries, the GDP and country and regions, their GDP were announced. And we can track, we're going to find that more than about 75% or the majority of the variation of the GDP performance can be explained by the difference of those countries' mobility reduction. And that's extremely powerful because before that, if you ask a macroeconomist, if you ask, how do we know Thailand's GDP will be grow faster or slower than United States? And you have no way to answer this question. You need a lot of data. But this is why we call this the pandemic economy, because you just need to compare the mobility difference between the two regions.
This is, sorry to interrupt, this is regardless of the level of digitization of that country's economy and mobility? How do you collect the data?
So we actually collect the data precisely using the digital technology. So that's because actually many countries, this is a global collaboration. You can think about the data collaboration. It's public big data. Actually, many data resources, including the Google, Apple, and in China's, in Baidu and the other resources, they actually publish the mobility data. So we actually put them together. The thing is to figure out, I think we're probably one of the first to figure out that this mobility, people just think it's the tracking the human flows related to work and to the retails. But we realize that this has a very strong relation with the economic situation. So then we link them together, we find that indeed a lot of the across country and regions economic variation can be explained by this. So then that becomes much easier. So essentially, so long as you can tell every country's mobility information, and then you can know the relation using the current data, you can map the mobility reduction and economic performance. You can pretty much figure out then what's going to happen to every country's economy, the progress. You can measure this daily. Of course, there's going to be the measurement error, but that's much, much better than without any measurement.
Relying on month-old numbers, yeah. So Mike, you know the old joke that an economist is someone who tells you tomorrow what happened yesterday or explains it in economic terms. Do you think we're going to see a shake-up in how we assess economies in the future? Because we need more predictive, we need better numbers.
Yes, I do. And furthermore, because of the digital underpinnings of economies, we're actually going to be able to do that. I mean, I think what Chen Long described that he and his colleagues did is a real innovation. Let me drop back briefly to vis-a-vis your question. It's possible that there are reasonably significant differences across economies in terms of how effectively they can function with imposed immobility. So there was a study done in the United States. And the question was, how many jobs can be performed, from home? And the answer was 33%. And when they looked at it by sector, the variation was huge. It ranged from over 50% in the tech sector and in finance to something like 4% in restaurants, hospitality sector. So I think it's reasonable to guess that if we looked across countries, we'd find different sectoral mixes, and we'd probably see some differentiation in their ability to keep the economy running with mobility restrictions. The way I think of that is that would be the next step in this research, is to try to kind of capture those things. But the most important point is that, with e-commerce and mobile payments and mobility data and whatnot, we are, for the first time, in a position almost to take real-time snapshots of what's going on in economies in a way that simply wasn't possible before. It's a revolution, I think. It used to be said that if you want to know what's going on in the economy, you have to talk to DHL and FedEx, because they're the ones that know where all the shipping's going. Well, now we've got DHL and FedEx and Alibaba and Ant Financial, and Amazon and Google and all that. So I think it's a pretty promising set of things once we learn to use them, and once we agree on who's going to have access to the data and how it will be used. That's obviously a major issue, right?
So let me,
okay, before we, yep.
Sorry.
Yes.
Let me come back to your earlier question. So you're asking, different countries have different digital technology. So how does that make a difference? Actually, if you think about this, if a country has advanced digital technology and if it can use it effectively to fight against a pandemic, that actually could result in a quick control of the pandemic, then goes through the recovery fairly quickly. And that's what we see actually as a lot of experience from the first wave countries, like the East Asian countries, including China. So that as a result, actually, you're going to see that they can recover quicker, much quicker, and they can get out of this much quicker. So that means that technology its impact will show up in the trajectory of the recovery. It's much faster. So things like that. And also, obviously, mobility cannot track everything, but it is a very good indicator of all-around performance. And sometimes we say, okay, every country claims they're going to control the pandemic. Actually, because there's a culture difference. People might not listen to the government. And so for this or that reasons, there's a different ability to execute the orders. But actually, you know what? They're going to show up in their activity level. And that's a result. So that means mobility is an endogenous number. It's not just from the government's orders. It also comes from how people will respond to such a crisis, and it will show up. So it doesn't matter the culture difference. It will show up in how much they choose to move, to move around, to carry on activities, and by how much reduction of that reduction of the mobility, and for how long we can get a reasonable sense of the economic performance. And more importantly, we actually can track this for more than 130 countries and regions. So that is very powerful, because that makes a very good comparison across globally. And so we can see all the waves. So we can compare, okay, sometimes we worry about Africa, we worry about the third wave country, or just some Asian countries and Latin American countries. But actually, we can measure those countries, Brazil, Mexico, all those, Kenya, the South Africa. Then that's very powerful. And we can, so that's the, yeah. It's pretty much like the medical workers, like the scientists. They're trying to find the solutions to track and measure, to try to find ways to deal with the pandemic. And we're social scientists, and we should work together globally to try to track that, to help a global community to battle the pandemic and the economic hit at the same time.
And Mike, to what extent do you think this sort of tool can be used by investors? Because right now we know that markets move on economic number releases. Do you think they'll provide a better snapshot?
Yes, I do. I don't think they're there yet. And one of the things that's been going on recently is that at least some of the markets have been, back in the pattern of diverging from, the underlying economic fundamentals. Although, the most recent experience was that they've kind of woken up. So I think markets do have a capacity to deviate, and they are driven by a number of factors, but one of the most important, of course, is the long-run performance of the economy. So this is going to, especially for traders, who need real-time information. I think this is going to be a very significant, addition to their toolkit.
You mentioned that divergence. And again, another old joke that right now we're seeing the Spanish flu, the tech bubble, and the great financial crisis possibly all at the same time.
Right.
What do you make of that? This, liquidity, stimulus, hopes-driven kind of US rally. I mean, yeah, there was a correction on Friday, but not nearly as, much as people think is needed to be reflective of the fundamentals.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and we're all operating, in a completely new world. So I'm not sure anybody has, a real fix on this. But so number one, when this hit, there was a kind of
but
panic
aren't you worried
reaction
about a possible bubble?
Yeah,
and then the subsequent
I am.
crash?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm very worried. I worried first that there was an overreaction on the downside. I mean, there was a panic response, and the markets went down, 30% plus. That was probably an overreaction. So some of the performance since then, I think, is just, sort of, getting back to some sense of equilibrium. The second thing is that not all sectors are impacted the same way, Lei and Chen. So the digital economy is doing reasonably well in the pandemic economy, because basically it's not only useful, but it's a substitute for all the things we normally do by going to the office and all that sort of thing, going to the mall. So the indices are increasingly weighted toward the digital major players, the Alibabas and Amazons and Googles and Apples of the world. And so there's a kind of built-in tendency to sort of have that element produce divergence vis-a-vis the economy as well. Bottom line is, I think there'll be a kind of convergent. No, sorry, there's one other factor, which is, depending on where you are, the markets are receiving wildly different signals, right? So some people are saying, I just as recently as this morning when I got up, somebody in the administration was talking about a V-shaped recovery in America. I mean, I think the
Seriously?
chance of, yeah, seriously. So I mean, I think that maybe they're just trying to talk up the situation and, in order to help the economy recover. But I think, on an objective basis, that's very unlikely, to put it mildly. So the markets, in a way, I think part of what you're seeing is volatility associated with just radical uncertainty of the type that we're all living with.
Let me ask you, Professor Chen, what do you make of this divergence in the US markets? Okay, we seem to be having...
Yeah, okay, yes. Okay, so I think there are actually new signals, and we actually can see from, for example, from our Luohan Academy's pandemic economy tracker. So if you look at it, actually there are several things happening. Let's just look at the United States, for example. If you look at United States, actually, from the April to May, for example, the unemployment rate in April was like 14.7%. To May, it actually, US added 2.5 million jobs. So that the unemployment rate reduced to 13.3%, still pretty high, but actually it looks better than April. So then, now, of course, there are some doubts because it depends on how you count it. Maybe that's because of the government stimulus programs. But even you correct that, we calculate this. Then the United States, the unemployment rate, if you look at the numbers, it's very dramatic. In March, it was 5.4%. Then in April, it's 19.2%. It's a huge jump. Then
wow.
in May, it's 16.1%. So it's still very high, but actually you can see it's getting relatively better month by month basis. Then if you look at the, so what I'm trying to say here is that the US economy, and actually it's the same thing for Europe. If we look at as I just mentioned, it's the mobility data. Actually, they are recovering. So it's not really V-shaped, but actually it's ticking up. So it's not really just L-shaped. It's not lying there dead. It's not like that. It's ticking back. And if the market is picking up that situation, so I think, and that's why when the mobility is picking up, you're going to see the unemployment rate is going to go down and the economy is going back. It will take a very long time probably to get back to the pre-pandemic level, but relative month by month is going up. And that's why it's not too surprising for me if the stock market is picking up the signal. And that's why it's useful. That's one point. And so it's not just about the stimulus package. It's a very loose explanatory monetary policies, but also actually economy's mobility level is picking up. That's my key point. Then add on to that is that I think it's Mike's point is that in the pandemic economy, actually the digital transformation is also picking up. So if you look, typical in the United States, you can separate. I was recently look at this. You can separate. You can see that that's very related to the technology, digital technology. The stock price has been much higher than a pre-pandemic level, and some of them hasn't recovered yet. But that's why on average, you can see that level has been recovered quite a bit. It's not just about the stimulus. So there's three reasons. Let's summarize. One reason is that there's obviously strong monetary and fiscal policies to support it. A second is that it's even the pandemic is as bad as it look, actually the mobility, economic activity level is picking up, relatively speaking. A third reason is that the digital transformation is also picking up. That is helping the whole economy to come better. So even though it will take a long time, it takes a long time probably to recover. And there's still a lot of uncertainty. For example, in the United States, if you look at we measure the pandemic economy, you can see that US pandemic level is not as controlled as many other countries. So it won't be surprising to us to see that there will be back and forth. So there's some reignition of the pandemic cases. Even in China, sometimes can break out a little bit regionally. And then if you can think about other countries, then that will hold back the economy. It will back zigzag a little bit. But in any case, we can see that it's not really the L shape. It's not quite V shape, but that kind of ticking
a lot
back.
of little zigzags.
Exactly. Plus the digital transformation is picking up, plus the stimulus policies, then you can see that investors can be very much encouraged for that reasons. But there's a lot of uncertainty still ahead.
Okay, and Mike, if we broaden this out a bit to multilateral organizations like the IMF that also need more accurate pictures of the global economies, do you think they should be relying more on these digital tools?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I guess these organizations have a global responsibilities, but a special responsibility for the developing countries, which in the context of the Academy's work in project, it was the third wave. And the third wave patterns that we see are rather different from what we saw in the first and second waves. So what Chen Long just described accurately for the first and second wave, we're tending not to see yet anyway in the third wave countries. So the patterns that I've seen using the Pandemic Economy Tracking Project are sharp economic drop, that's similar, and then a fairly prolonged period of suppressed economic activity. But the key point is that in Brazil and India, they're still in the danger zone with respect to the growth of the virus. So they're suffering the economic consequences without getting the first and second wave experience of controlling the spread of the virus or bringing the spread of the virus growth rate down. And so I think what's going on in these countries is they basically have run out of the capacity to suppress the economy. There's large groups of people who can't stay alive, if they're, and so I think it's absolutely crucial for the major international institutions, all of them, with slightly different functions, to be able to see these patterns and to start to address with a sense of urgency how we can help these countries shift into a more benign pattern. I don't think we want to see economies sort of struggle to recover economically while the virus is sort of out of control. That would be a kind of humanitarian disaster. But that's up to a first approximation what's going on now. But Chen Long may want to add to that. He's
yeah, Professor Chen, come in on this.
Yeah, so it's just we can see that we kind of predicted. We can see that the wave will hit the developing countries, emerging markets, and that those countries have different characteristics from the East Asian countries or the Europe and the United States. So these countries, in general, many of them, not all of them, many of them, they lack the capacity to deal with the medical capacity, to deal with the large wave of pandemic, nor do they have enough economic rescue ability. So their trajectory will be very different, and that's precisely what we see in the third wave. It's really worrisome, and so they see very diverse results. Some of the countries actually recovered fairly fast. If you look at let's look at Asian countries. You can see that, for example, Vietnam, actually it recovered very fast, and now it's the economic level. It's up to the East Asian, other Eastern countries. So it's really running back, recovering very well. Another good example is the Thailand, and it's also doing well. But then you look at India, then it's really struggling with the two dimension at this point. The problem is that how are you going to deal with this? If you control the pandemic, you have to sacrifice the economy. But can people sustain such a loss for how long? If you want to let the economy to come back, then the pandemic will come back. And so that you can see from our pandemic economy tracking system, you can see that that's exactly what's going on. When the economy activity going up, actually the pandemic spreading speed is also picking up. Actually, it's getting worse. So how do you balance those two situations? So that's exactly happened in countries like India and some other countries, for example, Philippines. Philippines is making some good progress in controlling the pandemic. But then in the meantime, economies suffer a lot of loss. So some other countries like Brazil, like South Africa, many of them are like Mexico. They are dealing. It's not clear they are making good progress in controlling the pandemic. But in the meantime, they have the challenge to recover the economy. It will be very hard. So you can see a very divergence of performance. Then it's really important to measure and track them to help the policymakers and help the general public, the companies, entrepreneurs to make the right decisions.
Okay, so say I'm a small business owner in Brazil, or I'm a policy maker in India. How should I use this tool? How should I use the tracker to help me make decisions for my region, my country, my company?
Do you want me to answer this?
Yes, please. Unless you want to come in on this first, Mike.
No, I think there's a variety of things that I've concluded from this. One of them is, I think there's an element of inevitability in poorer countries that can't sustain long periods of economic shutdown, that the toll the virus will take in terms of human lives will just be higher. And that's, I think there's parts of that that are unavoidable. The second conclusion that I've drawn from studying the Academy's tracking graphs is that many countries need an enormous amount of external support, both in the medical dimension and in expanding the fiscal space to buffer the shock on the economic side as well. So, that's been talked a lot about, and unfortunately, it's an economic environment in which economic cooperation has been less than ideal. And so I'm not sure we're going to sort of get along with that. The third factor is in some countries, they're just making mistakes. I think, either because of lack of information, and I think Brazil would be a good example of that, kind of mishandling the thing, and maybe the comparative data that you get out of this, 131 country tracking project could help correct those mistakes.
Okay, Professor Chen.
Yeah, so I think let's go back to the case of the herd immunity concept. Why do countries want to bring up that concept? Because it's very hard to make the hard decision. Because it's very hard. We really don't want to suffer the economic loss
very
to control
unpopular.
Yeah, but then we realize later that the less you do, the slower you do, actually the more you suffer. From data, from our tracker data, you can see that the countries that makes the swift, more decisive decisions, they actually recover faster. They also suffer less life or economic loss. It's the actually countries or regimes that are hesitant. They kind of reluctant to make the painful decisions. They actually suffer even more. So how do you use this? Therefore, I think for the policymakers, globally, we do not see an option not to do anything. So essentially, you just have to suffer the economic loss to control the pandemic at a certain level. Then you can think about the recovery. But how fast is my country at the territory is safe enough to reignite the economy, and what's the progress. And when you recover the economy, then the pandemic is going to come back in spots, hit you. So where are we? Should we shut down again? Slower or faster? For all those things, you just have to measure your pandemic and economic loss at the same time. That's how I think the governments will find it could be useful. We find many countries, they pretend not to look at this. They're trying to say that, okay, it's going to happen anyway. We're going to use our medical capacity to support it. It didn't go very well. So now we just have to measure it, especially for the countries that do not have very good other tracking systems. I think it's especially important for them. So that's how I think the policymakers can use it. Then for the entrepreneurs, they can sense this. If they want to, or the investors, if they want to know where is my regime, the country of interest, where it is, how fast can it recover? You know what? You just have to look at how pandemic is controlled and relative to the economy. So you want to measure two things as investor or entrepreneur. You want to know my country is at which level of this pandemic economy. It's really picking up the recovery speed, or is struggling at the bottom. And so you have to measure that. Then you have to also to measure, okay, how much my economy is being hit, and how much is my industry is being hit. Where is the growth opportunity? Or for all those things, you just have to measure both pandemic and economy at the same time.
Okay.
I would add
Mr.
one other
Spence.
thing, Lei.
Yep.
Just one.
Yes.
I'd add one other thing. It's more talked about now, and it's important. Probably we can imagine adding this to the tracking project, but the overall pattern that is emerging is that the people within a country who are the hardest hit tend to be in the lower part of the income distribution in that country. So this is a highly, regressive shock that every country is experiencing and dealing with. And so I think part of the answer to your earlier question is both for individual countries and for the global community at large is we need to focus on especially trying to buffer the shock and protect the people who are the most vulnerable. And they tend to be the ones in the lower part of the income distribution.
Okay, so right now we have seen global central bank. Yes, Professor Chen.
Right. I just want to add one. So
Sure.
One thing is that we need to track which are the countries that are more vulnerable in the stage of the pandemic economy. Another thing is that we talk about the global supply chain will be hit hard, but then they are not the same. For example, if you look at Vietnam, and just I mentioned, or Thailand, you can see that you can tell the supply chain, those countries will recover faster, just like China and some other regimes. So you can see that from all perspective, from a business sense, that it makes a lot of sense to track the progress for different regimes and countries.
Mike, you mentioned vulnerable parts of the population. What else really concerns you about where we are at this stage of the global pandemic? And what should we do at the policy level to address those concerns?
So apart from what we've talked about up till now, and that Chen Long has kind of highlighted, all of which I agree with, I think the thing I'm most worried about is the dimension of international cooperation. Both now.
You were trying to be very
right?
diplomatic there.
Yes, I was. Yes. I've tried to avoid sort of, kind of figuring out who's at fault, or, playing the blame game, because it doesn't get you anywhere. But in a few areas, we do have really good international cooperation. I would say in the kind of things that the Academy is doing, it's a pretty open system, and the kind of thing the scientists, the doctors, the vaccine producers, and so on, probably pretty good cooperation. But we need cooperation all over the place. We need, cooperation on supply chains. We need cooperation on tracking. If we're going to open the international travel business, which is a critical element of, global interconnectedness, not to mention tourism and whatnot, we just need a much higher level of cooperation and, together figuring out how to deal with the challenges than we have now. Right now, I think, we have basically a kind of fortress mentality. Every country is sort of trying to open up within and assumes everybody else is making a mistake, so we won't let them in, right? And that's a bit of an exaggeration, but that's not the ideal way to try to handle this, I think.
Professor Chen?
Yeah, so
your biggest concerns?
Sometimes we call this the distancing economy. So we have to have a distance. And unfortunately, and that's really, it's also a big test on the trust system, traditional trust system. So we're not really collaborating because we thought we're going to protect ourselves. So we're going to isolate ourselves from our neighbors. But so unfortunately, we have to collaborate to move ahead. That's exactly the global economy has made tremendous progress in the past 100 years, especially after the Second World War. So this is a huge test on each of us. So it's not just about protecting ourselves, because if our neighbors are hurt, we will not be able to, we're not immune from that. So I think for this big test, we just have to collaborate together, just like the medical doctors work together, scientists, and we are social scientists. We should really collaborate across the borders. We should try to help to all of us together to measure the progress, the lack of progress, to find the solutions. And this is a big test, because if we pretend we are safe, but our neighbors are not, then I think in the end, it will hurt all of us very badly. So that's the big test is still very going on. And even you can see that the whole pandemic is still, even in China, in the East Asian countries, still coming up in pockets. We're not immune. We're going to live with the pandemic for quite a long time, unless probably some effective vaccine will become useful. But then, and also, if you look at why, another reason why the pandemic has become rampant is actually in the South Globe, because it's their winter. And so I think then gradually our winter will come. So how are we going to collaborate to deal with this? That will also largely determine how much we can still trust each other on the global system, global economy, global supply chain, global collaboration. So those efforts, they are useful. Even minor efforts are still very useful.
Mike, are you optimistic that we will see a more collaborative, cohesive global economy once we have a working vaccine? We'll have more trust and economies will come back to pre-pandemic levels?
Well, it would certainly help, but the honest answer, Lei, is that I'm not that optimistic about that. And the reason is, the pre-pandemic trends were in the opposite direction. So if you were going to stick with a forecast that we were going to do better job in cooperating, you'd have to argue that I think that the pandemic somehow changed our attitudes. Now, I'd like to think this is true, but honestly, I wouldn't bet my children's savings on doing a 180-degree about face on this. No, I think it's going to take something. Maybe the pandemic in the long run will help, but if we're going to deal effectively with climate change, if we're going to, prevent a collapse of the convergence process for the developing world that was underway before, if we're going to deal with future pandemics, then maybe a younger generation will take this over and sort of, force the issue. So I'm not completely pessimistic, but in the short run, it looks like we're going in the wrong direction, I guess.
And concluding thoughts from you, Professor Chen?
Yeah, it's it's really sometimes it reminds us of the both the before the First World War and Second World War period. The countries are trying to protect themselves, and they are just kind of don't collaborate very well. It's after they suffered a lot, then they decide in World War that the helping each other, have a global collaborative political, economic, and the financial system is the best way to promote the human prosperity. And that has brought a very long a period of progress. And history tells us that human beings, they only learn after they suffer a lot. So I'm also somewhat not so upbeat about the I don't know how much we have to suffer for us to realize that we have to collaborate better, but we just have to make efforts. And we compared to before, we rely so much more on each other. And the pandemic or the future environmental challenges or other challenges, they don't count the countries. Don't look at the color of the skins. So we really, for all reasons, we just have to unite. We have to try our best.
Thanks so much. And I hope that the digital tool, the Pandemic Economic Tracker, will help us go towards that goal. So thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. We really need digital tools like the PET to help us make better decisions now. And we know that, you know, around the world, there's still a lot of division, but at least the mobility does tell us more accurate and timely picture of where we are in the pandemic economy, and that will help policymakers divert or allocate resources where most needed, and for companies to know where to invest and where the opportunities are. So a big thank you to Professor Chen Long, Executive Director of Luohan Academy, joining us from Beijing, and from somewhere along the beautiful coast of Italy, Nobel Laureate economist, Mr. Micheal Spence. Thank you so much for your discussion today. Thank you to all our viewers for joining us around the world. Please stay healthy and safe wherever you are.